Hello, welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem alongside me, award winner, musician, and the amazing owner of the Comedy Cellar, Noam Dworman,
Thank you, Hatem. That's very nice of you. Thank you.
who just recently performed at the Lincoln Center, which is
hmm
a big deal.
I did.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not my first time performing at places like that. I've been played in Carnegie Hall. I played in Town Hall. I played at Kennedy Center. I had a
The
little
Trump,
career
the
as a
Trump
musician.
Kennedy Center.
The Trump, yeah, forgive me, the Trump Kennedy Center. Yeah.
But you never say anything about it. I just had to find out for somebody else. Um,
Yeah.
And our guest of honor is Michel Paradis. He's a great friend of us, and he's amazing. And he's exactly the guy that you want to talk to right now. He is a human rights lawyer, international and national security expert, um, author, everything. Great to have you again.
I'm glad to be everything.
Always,
Uh,
always, yeah. You're exactly the person we need to talk. So let's.
But just before we go, by the way, you really are one of the best. And I don't know, maybe you need an agent or something. You should be on. Are you on TV? I don't really watch the news anymore. You should be on TV
oh,
regularly when things like this happen.
well, thank you. No, I don't do that. I'm probably more shy than I come off as, but yeah, no, I'm happy to talk. Although everything is mathematically the same as nothing. Um,
Yes.
so so I'm happy to take both.
When,
I'm,
when,
I'm gonna I'm gonna try to see if I can get any connections for you.
Well, thank you. I'm
and he's
happy to.
he's been involved in some big cases. Oh, what's the one that you talked about when we had that show in Jersey? The hate case?
What was it? Well, I had a bunch of torture cases because I think that was the subject of the night. And so yeah, no, I've done a bunch of torture cases and mostly coming out of the Guantanamo context, like detainees who got tortured in Guantanamo and by the CIA.
So for
And you're
my
aga- you're
people,
you're you're against torture, correct?
I am against torture,
All
just
right,
to
that
be
ma-
clear.
so so
That's a
there, so
I know
so
that's a controversial position today.
so there
But
goes
yes,
CBS. I guess you won't be on
that's
CBS. I'm
right.
kidding. I'm kidding.
but yeah, for my
Forgive
people,
me. That was a very sarcastic joke. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, he's huge deal in Guantanamo Bay. For my people, thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right, so let's break it down and get talk obviously about Venezuela and all that. But to start, so they had weapon of mass destruction, and then what happened?
Venezuela?
Yeah, they
I,
didn't.
No, no.
I
Let's
think.
go. Let's get into it seriously. Come on. Come on. Come on.
All right, fine. All right, so first, let's take just a reaction first, and then we'll break it down one by one, part by part. What's your reaction to what happened?
I think my hot take when I heard the news over the weekend was kind of this like, what? You know, what I mean, like what happened exactly? Because this whole gear up towards Venezuela over the course of the Trump administration has been just kind of a bit left field, right? Like Venezuela has never been one of the major national security priorities of the United States. It's a problem, right? It's seen as a rogue state, but it's below typically North Korea when you think about genuine national security threats who pose existential risks to the United States or even significant risks to the United States, the way Iran does, obviously the way Russia does now. Um, so Venezuela's always been this sort of like rogue actor kind of in league with, Cuba or, various African countries that we've had hostile relationships with over the years, Syria maybe, but never like a top priority in which we're going to initiate major military and political action. So that was the big surprise, just how much Venezuela has been prioritized over the course of the Trump administration. Part of me suspects, and this is just a suspicion, but I think it's like, worth at least considering how much of that has been kind of a snowballing of arguments the Trump administration initially made in the immigration context. Because you may remember, soon after he took office, they started doing these very aggressive immigration raids all around the country, including and including in places where they were said it slightly differently, including by invoking something called the Alien Enemies Act, which is this law that was passed back in 1789, I think, no, sorry, 1798, which just allows for a much more summary process to exclude aliens of hostile foreign powers. And the Trump administration grabbed onto this as a way of, fast tracking a lot of their immigration policies, fast tracking deportations, and making what at the time seemed like an almost ridiculous argument about Tren de Agua, which is a Venezuelan gang, being essentially a terrorist organization that's at war with the United States. And and I say sort of ridiculous, not just because, I don't like it, but the courts uniformly basically rejected this argument. Like there were edge cases here and there where various courts were like, well, maybe, there's some deference due to the president, but no one, plausibly believes that the United States was at war with Venezuela. Um, but then over the course of the past year, we've started seeing, an increasing escalation of actual warlike acts against Venezuela. First, the bombing of, drug boats in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and now this
Alleged drug boats,
alleged
right?
drug boats, right? Like alleged drug boats in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and now like an actual invasion of Venezuela and the promise to, at least by the president, to sort of run the country, from here on out. And so there is this element of, you know, like, have we sleptwalked into, or have we been sleepwalking into a war with Venezuela because, sort of starting with this germ of an idea of how to use immigration laws more aggressively, sort of metastasizing and focusing the administration much more on Venezuela as a national security threat. I don't know. That's just a kind of a guess and a sort of looking at the arc of the past year. But yeah, my initial reaction, long answer to a short question, but my initial reaction was just, really? Like that's what we've been doing. And there are a whole lot of legal issues that spawn from that. But I was really just kind of surprised, and I think like a lot of people were.
No,
Well, I mean, I first of all, I don't know. I mean, I made I tweeted something. Actually, I might have it right in front of me. Um, I said, the runaround's third. The coach gives the stop sign. He ignores it and he slides into home. If he's safe, all is forgiven. If he's out, he's a goat. And I think that's the way a lot of these things work out. Obviously, if this works out famously for Venezuela and prosperity is back on track, and then it's going to be very difficult to make the arguments about international law. So I really don't know. I'm not informed. I understand that almost all the reasons in some way given are pretextual, although the sum total of them is probably a real concern in the world that we'd like to, address if we could. But it all leads me back to my real concerns about international law, which is why I like to talk to Michel. And this goes, we've had this conversation about Israel and just, I mean, I could really go into a long thing, but maybe I can make the argument by asking Michel some questions.
but before you do it, let me, I want to say,
Yes.
yeah, it's just
Oh,
like
so,
I don't think, I don't know when this worked before in history, so we can keep repeating it, over and over. And also the fact that, uh, the oil part of it, where people say, it's about the oil, it's about business, it's about, you cannot ignore that angle. But my main thing is like, when was that ever worked before for us to keep trying it? But yeah, go ahead.
Japan,
Japan.
Germany,
That's the only one.
Korea.
And it's only the only culture, and it's far away,
No, and
geographically.
even I don't know much about this stuff, but even our exploits that are considered, shameful in South America, I think they kind of transitioned, like in Chile. Chile has transitioned into a pretty good place, and I don't know that the path to that transition didn't go through our, supposedly illegal exploits in Chile. But you know, yeah, we could talk about the fact that we have to keep control of our own hemisphere. And we could also talk about the fact that a lot of the people who are really outraged by this made all these excuses for Putin trying to keep control of his area. But anyway, I was going to say something. So this is where I start. I don't know all about international law, but every school, and I looked it up, every schoolboy understands that the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, and this is the key phrase, Hatem, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And to me, I divide the world into consent of the governed and victims of the governed. And somehow when I'm supposed to recognize Maduro as a representative of a quote unquote sovereign state when we know he stole the election and maintains power at the point of a gun, despite what international law may or may not say, I find it very, very hard to feel that a sovereign nation has been slighted here in the same way that if a Chinese, Russian, espionage team took over Japan somehow and installed a government, but I say, well, no, that's the sovereign government of Japan. And so my, simplistic analysis here starts with the fact that this guy is not the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. The other guy is. What's his name, Michelle? The guy who lost the election?
Gutierrez, I think it is.
I think it was a woman.
No,
Well,
no, she
she
left.
couldn't run.
Yeah.
What's her name? But
Whoever it
yeah.
is. I mean, if Kamala Harris, if we all knew Kamala Harris had actually won millions of more votes than Trump, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and Trump held a gun to the Supreme Court justices' heads, and so they rubber stamped the election, we would not consider Trump to be the sovereign ruler of the United States. Everybody would know it's really Kamala Harris. And then any exploits that other nations did to try to help Kamala Harris get back to where she's supposed to be, would that just be the same thing as if she wasn't the person who won the election? So this is where I immediately struggle. And so let's start there, Michelle. What does international law say about all that?
Yeah, let me just add to this before Michelle goes. Is like, but this is happening in so many spots in the world. So why?
Let's just limit it to here. Let's just listen. I answer that. We can't handle every problem, but if we can handle one.
But it looks like there is other things to it.
Let's not change the subject yet.
Yeah. So here, I'll just break that down like in a simple way, just to answer the direct question. So, as a matter of international law, the UN Charter is very, very clear on a principle of non-intervention outside the parameters of the UN authorizing intervention in a sovereign state. And so what does that mean? What is a sovereign state? What's it take? Sovereign state does not mean a democratic state, does not mean a legitimate state, does not mean a well-run state, doesn't mean a good state. It just means a sovereign state with its own internal governmental operations and rules of the road that it complies with in order to basically define its boundaries and essentially be the equivalent of like a legal person or a corporation as a matter of international law. And so on the one hand, I think most sensible people can entirely agree with the premise of like, fuck Maduro, right? Like who cares, right? Like he's a bad guy. He's run Venezuela into the ground. Venezuelan oil production over the past like 5 years has gone from I think 3 million barrels a day to 1 million, right?
So one third of the population has left. They're in a death spiral.
There's massive refugee flows, including into the United States, not to mention Venezuela. Like so I don't think you have to hold a candle or a brief for Maduro to answer the legal questions. Indeed, like the legal questions are supposed to be resolvable and answered regardless of whether or not the particular victim is sympathetic or unsympathetic. And so how does the legal analysis break down? Well, the UN Charter is very clear. We're not supposed to invade under other sovereign countries who are member states of the United Nations. And the analogy I would potentially pose here is, less essentially like a militarized sort of coup d'etat, although even that would offer them some sovereignty, would offer them sovereignty so long as it was recognized by their own government, essentially. But take Bush v. Gore, right? Imagine in the context of Bush v. Gore, let's say, Al Gore's allies in China thought that the Supreme Court's decision, 5-4 decision, granting the presidency to George W. Bush was illegitimate and therefore invaded the United States to depose George W. Bush and reinstall Al Gore as president. Would that be a violation of international law? Yes, it clearly would be a violation of international law, right? It would just be like, and it's not a close point. Would that be legitimate in the eyes of Al Gore's supporters? Maybe. I don't want to speak for them, but I think they would probably have some qualms about even Al Gore sort of in his famous speech saying, I disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, but I respect it because that's our question of our internal law.
That's the consent of the governed. We
Well,
understand.
but that's my point. Is like in that situation, right? Al Gore had won both the popular vote and arguably had won the Electoral College, save for the intervention of the Supreme Court. Right? I'm trying to use a contested a situation where there was a real contest about
I
who
understand
the
what you're saying. Actually,
legitimate
it's the
elected
opposite.
leader was.
Actually, he didn't win the Supreme Court did not overrule an electoral college. I don't want to get
But
bogged down.
yeah, but I'm just
You're
saying.
making
So
a point. I get
yeah,
you.
I'm just sort of making the point that, right, like we may find that result and the process leading to it deeply dysfunctional for a lot of reasons, in the same way that Maduro's, retention of power, his sort of auto coup in Venezuela demonstrates deep dysfunction, if nothing else, in the Venezuelan government. But we don't make these calls about sovereignty based on the quality of the leaders and the quality of the governmental institutions. We make them as based on countries. And the reason we do that, I'll just say this as the last point. And the reason we do this, the reason we sort of have a certain level of content neutrality when it comes to the quality of any sovereign state is because as soon as you cross that threshold and say, well, if we don't like that government, if we find them illegitimate, if we find them to be sort of not up to the standards of our Declaration of Independence, well, then the whole concept of sovereignty and the whole structure of the United Nations systems breaks down at its core. And that system is designed to do one thing and really one thing only, to prevent wars, right? To prevent large scale world wars. And
So
so if you basically say, nope, we're back into 19th century spheres of influence, you're just asking to start having world wars because that's how world wars start.
so let me. Yeah, of course. I don't think there's any perfect answer here, but I would say obviously the United Nations has not actually stopped many wars. Any as opposed to our Supreme Court, which may be biased, but is not a corrupt enterprise. The UN votes in the Security Council. This is a totally corrupt power politics vote. No, obviously, no, Russia and China are not going to vote for any kind of military action for anything which is against their interest, period, no matter how objective the case is. One could argue that the United States putting its foot down on an illegal election and immiseration of a nation within its hemisphere will deter many more similar actions of would-be gangsters with guns throughout our hemisphere than the United Nations protection does. On a case-by-case basis, you can go either way. But I just call bullshit on the whole concept of international law, especially because, in criminal law, you have these rules, but then they're refined and tweaked by judges, and you have exceptions to the exclusionary rule and hot pursuit and good faith, and there's all kinds of where the judges say, well, actually, this rule in the real world doesn't serve good and righteous morality as the law was written to serve. So we have to bend it and shape it. And international law now more and more just becomes the refuge of the scoundrels. Hamas
I would
buried
disagree with
itself in
that.
tunnels.
I would say the same, and I'm not drawing a moral equivalence, so please don't
Yeah.
misunderstand me. But I would say the same character of argument would be articulated by the Russians vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right? They basically said Ukraine is a corrupt state that is systematically disenfranchising Russian-speaking and ethnic Russians, particularly in the east of Ukraine, in places like Crimea. We are we are the protectors of ethnic Russians around the world, given our status as Russia, and therefore it's our duty to protect Greater Russia. It's our literal border state, right? It's our backyard. So we're going to invade, even though it clearly violates the sovereignty of Ukraine, in order to assert our interests and ensure that the Ukrainian state is respecting Russian values.
Yeah,
Um,
I get it. The problem is that everybody knows Zelensky won fair and square, and the Ukrainians are fighting like hell.
I could probably give you reams of articles on Russian on Russian news sites
I know,
contesting that very
but I'm
point.
saying what's true? What's true? But but of course, I understand. That's what I said. I mean, there's no perfect solution here.
Well, but
I
that's what,
fi-
and that's my point. Is I'm
the
by no
UN,
means.
your framework didn't stop Russia from taking Ukraine, right? And the UN's not voting to get them out.
Well,
Can
it
I
has
say
in this.
something here? Like
It has. Yeah.
I feel like, with all these things, with all the argument, the problem is we always try to find, or people always try to find, it's like, oh, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and therefore they act that way.
I
The
didn't
truth
say
is,
good guys and bad.
no,
I
I'm not
said
saying you. I'm saying
consent of the governed.
no,
You
but you're talking about our laws.
listen, at some point, especially now with modern technology, you get to the point where 20 guys take over with a bunch of weapons, and the whole world has to say, "Oh, they're to be respected."
Well,
And at
no,
some
that
point, I'm like, "Come on now,
But
they don't
but
have
the
to be
only
respected."
reason we're doing this is because this is my point is like the only reason people judge into something is because of their own interest in it. So why can't we just say we have an interest in moving this? It's not because we're the good guys. It's not because of this is a bad guy. It's not about any of that. And same thing with Russia. Why can't we say that? Because this is the truth, right, Michel?
Well, no, but I think this is sort of the core of my point. As someone who does not, I am not a romantic about international law. I think it's a fairly weak institution writ large, but I think it does provide a certain basic framework in which to draw important distinctions. Because if you think that the Maduro government is, immiserating its people and illegitimately, seizing power from the democratically elected leaders, there are ways in which to deal with that. You do it things like we're doing. We impose sanctions, you build up alliances, you do everything we did in Ukraine. And so, yes, these principles of international law did not stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it certainly has held it back, right? President Zelensky is still the president of Ukraine. It's been a brutal, grinding war, but the Russians have not succeeded in annexing the entire Ukrainian state the way they very much anticipated they would.
It's not
And they probably would
sanctions.
have and they probably would have had we not imposed, fairly intensive sanctions on all aspects of the Russian economy, had we not mobilized Europe to essentially rearm to defend Ukraine, had we not provided Ukraine astronomical amounts of
Yeah, that's
weapons
the
with which
key.
to defend themselves.
Providing the weapons. Yeah.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. So there are ways in which you can actually enforce the norms of international law, enforce the principles of international law against those who would seek to transgress them. And my concern about this sort of most recent adventure into Venezuela, regardless of how it turns out, right? Because it could turn out fine, as you say, but it could turn out really badly. We don't really know.
And we don't care. That's the main
No, we
thing.
can't. At the point where 1/3 of the country is leaving, they're literally in a death spiral, and to sit there and watch it play out.
But that's not the. But the alternative between the alternatives are not sit there and watch it play out and invade it.
Sanctions are very slow. I mean, it could be another 20 years before, who knows?
We've been very effective in imposing sanctions on all sorts of places, whether or not it's Iran or Russia.
Yeah, but the advantage of Iran is that people can't leave, right? Like in Venezuela, we'll just hasten everybody leaving. And listen, I don't think we actually disagree.
Yeah,
there's no good answers here.
Right, but I think there are better and worse answers as well. Because if
you were a citizen of Venezuela,
yeah,
the average citizen that's struggling right now,
yeah,
you're more likely like my answer than yours, right?
I'm not sure about that. In part because for two reasons. One is, no one has ever. There are very few cases of countries welcoming liberation from their own government from abroad, even hostile governments. And I would take Iraq as sort of the most salient example, where we go into a country with unquestionably probably the most brutal dictator in the world at that time, who had systematically murdered hundreds of thousands of the people who we were ostensibly liberating. Our going into that country the way we did destabilized it into a civil war in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were killed and displaced. And the balance of political power in the country shifted in such wrenching ways that you had death squads, you said essentially Shia death squads going against Sunni death squads.
Let me ask you a question.
And so, let me just to finish
Yeah.
this point, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm a Venezuelan and I see that the last major example of a major power where there was a decapitation strategy executed by the United States led to a violent and extremely wrenching civil war that lasted for the better part of 10 years and killed millions of people, I'm not sure I would welcome that as the solution in my own country.
That's what I want to ask you.
Even if I was opposed to Maduro. And the last point I'll make is, and it's not even clear that that's what we're doing, right?
Wait,
It's not like we have insisted. It's not like the Trump administration has insisted on installing the legitimate democratic government in Venezuela. We basically just respected their own internal government rules of succession. So I think I'm not sure it's the vice president, but whatever the equivalent of
yeah.
the vice president of Maduro's own party and regime is now in power, and we're respecting that, and we're saying we're going to back you up as long as you do what we say as a client state. And I think that also, if I'm a Venezuelan, I'm going to have a lot of trouble with, especially if I'm the kind of Venezuelan you're talking about, who's worried
So,
about
so wait. So let me answer.
democratic legitimacy in my country.
Your last point there, I agree with actually, and I don't. That's not knowing enough about it. I'm like, what the hell are they doing with that? So I agree with that. But the earlier point, I just having no knowledge of Venezuela, I know very well. We knew that Iraq was a tribal cauldron that could come uncorked when we went in there. Is that is there a similar risk of factional, psychotic internecine violence in Venezuela? I haven't heard that.
So
Like,
I don't again know enough about the politics of Venezuela to speak with the kind of particularity that we now know to have been true in Iraq.
but we
But
always knew that about Iraq. We always knew it
well,
was we always knew it was a Shia majority. Saddam Hussein
But
was a
what
Sunni.
was said then? What was said then that they're gonna welcome us? They want.
welcome us as liberators, right? Like I think
This is what was
we had
said.
a
That
fairly
was all.
rosy.
That was also said, but we also knew, and the opposition leader, we knew. Everybody knows that Shia and Sunni were living together, and they kill each other. We knew that. We knew that.
But I
But
think, I mean, I don't think you need to go that far back into the history of South America to see some very dirty civil wars, to include in the neighboring states of Colombia, right?
yeah,
Colombia is only now pulling itself out of what was, a 30, 40 year essentially civil war that was heavily fueled by the drug trade, which also exists in Venezuela, right? You don't need to have these sort of deep tribal religious conflicts
and I may
to,
add,
to
it's
create
not.
the kind of violent political factions that can seriously destabilize a country and lead to the kind of dirty wars that we have seen in Chile, in Argentina, in
But
Colombia, to
Michelle,
some extent, in
Michelle,
Venezuela, in Bolivia, right?
Let
let
me
me
So,
ask
just
you a
add to
question.
that. Let
Wait,
me
wait,
let me
wait.
just
Well,
add
let
to
me just ask
that. Not
Michelle one
only.
question. Hold on.
yeah.
Let me just ask you one question. If 2 years from now Venezuela is doing much better, you will still say it was not proper, right? Like it.
I would so look, there's a lot we don't know, and I'm trying to have a fair bit of like epistemological humility about that.
Mhm.
Um, but just on the face of it, just in literally invading a country with your military in order to execute an arrest warrant against the head of state, without any kind of notice, effort to sort of use diplomacy for that purpose, without building any sort of coalition or regional support for that purpose, without just treating it like an extradition or at least attempting to do that first. Yeah, that makes me really nervous. It's a very radical thing to do that has very few positive precedents to support it. Maybe it'll work out. Maybe we get lucky, and I hope that's true. I'm not a psychopath. I'm not, I'd rather be wrong than right. But looking at it now, it certainly doesn't, again, I struggle to find good historical models that suggest that this is going to be the kind of success you're suggesting. I hope that's true. I really do.
I'm not suggesting.
And maybe there are things I don't know, and I'm very eager
Can I
to
say a few
believe there
Go
quick
are.
ahead. Go ahead. I'm
points?
not suggesting a success, by the way. Go ahead, Hatem.
Yeah.
First is it's not only the fear of civil war, and this was not only the bad thing that happened in Iraq. The problem is the international influence from other countries around. This is what happened in Iraq. It's like Iran was in,
Right.
Saudi Arabia was in, Israel was in, Saudi, so it's not
Turkey was
only
in the
that.
north.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Turkey was in, Egypt. It's like, it's just so much. So this is one. Two is like we have to stop trying to tell people how to live and how to change. The change need to come from a leader within. We can support that leader, but and this is the international feel about change. Same thing with like when I said about Palestinians repeatedly, they need to have a leader. So if there's no leader coming in, and most importantly is like, what about all the which we're going to discuss in a few all the comments that Trump says, we're going to take over, we're going to pay ourselves with the oil. Like, this is a bad intention. So if I'm a Venezuelan and I hear this, I was like, what the fuck? No, this is my money. You're not going to
Look, look, Hatem. This is the thing. Of course, it's informative to look at previous examples of various things to decide, what you think about it, to examine it. But you're talking about very, very, very few very, very, very small sample size with situations which are vastly different. And certainly, I think we should all understand that if we had 100 such incidents, a certain number of them would turn out horribly, a certain number of them would turn out very, very well, and a certain number may be ambiguous. To say that because Iraq turned out badly, we can say with full confidence what Trump is doing in Venezuela without the regard to international law is a mistake and can't work. And this is very shallow thinking.
I'll tell you
Well,
why.
no, I'm not just focused on Iraq.
No, I'm talking about Hatem.
Yeah,
Hatem.
no, but
Okay.
let me say this. It's not about what he did. It's about what he's saying.
Oh, that's another one. Just
Taking
one thing
over
at a time.
stuff.
I'm just
Yeah,
trying to make
listen.
the point in general, and
Yeah.
this applies to many, many things that come up in politics.
Yeah,
You're dealing
but-
with very, very small sample sizes,
But
and you
also-
got to get. It's just you just got to go a little bit deeper than the fact. Oh, they tried it that way once, so therefore that's out of the. Just cross that off the list.
I am trying,
you know?
but I'm taking the history in mind, and I'm taking like how
Maybe
many
you
players-
learned from your mistakes in the way you did it that
Sure.
time,
And
and
I-
do it
I'm
better
also-
this time.
And I'm also taking an advantage how many players are involved in this. China and Russia are involved deeply in Venezuela. Also, Venezuela with the oil reserve, with the all the minerals, all this. It's a place where I can see that a lot of countries going to be willing to do it. But let's go a
I think Michelle wanted to say something.
Well, I just want to say on the historical precedents, right? It's not just Iraq. You mentioned Chile. Like our assistance, so to speak, in deposing Allende, bringing up
Egypt
the
and
Pinochet regime
after
led
First
to
World War.
to mass atrocities in Chile in a civil war that spanned the entire 1970s, such that Pinochet, when he finally left office, was indicted as a war criminal by his own courts. And so I mean that is what
Okay,
makes
we got.
me nervous.
What about
is-
Milosevic? Are we sorry that we got rid of Milosevic? Was that legal? No.
Well, Milosevic was deposed from within. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And I guess my point, and this sort of does sort of
We
build
kind of
up on-
brought it about, right? I mean,
Well, right, but exactly through a long campaign of
And bombing.
economic, military, and political pressure
and bombing. Didn't we bomb?
during the war in Kosovo, yes, which technically was illegal. That's probably the closest example that people
Yeah.
often cite is what Tony Blair said is it was illegal, but it was the right thing to do. But
But it worked out.
Right, but but I guess I'm just saying that's not what we did here. And I think Venezuela is a strategically significant enough country, and to kind of getting to I think what our Hatem's real points here is that we can't just assume that there's now going to be just self-government in Venezuela. You have international actors from Iran who's dependent on Venezuelan oil, obviously to China and Russia, who are happy to screw with the United States at any opportunity they can, who will have a significant interest in backing factions
And they're
inside
already
of Venezuela.
involved. They've been involved.
That's what I mean, and will continue to
Yeah.
have significant
Yeah.
interest in backing factions inside of Venezuela to ensure it remains unstable. The closest example I can think of to those kinds of dynamics playing themselves out recently is Sudan, right? Sudan is another situation where we essentially assisted initially South Sudan in breaking off, and that was seen as a great triumph and prevention potentially of a genocide. But now Sudan is essentially divided between various just military factions, right? There's no ethnic, religious, cultural line. These are just military, political factions who have different backers from different parts of the world and are, leading to probably what is, I hate to rank these things, but it's certainly one of the most brutal and sort of violent humanitarian crises in the world right now, and it's a brutal civil war. And you're dealing with a part of the world that has a lot of natural resources and a lot of illicit trade to begin with. And so it does not strike me as preposterous. Again, I hope it doesn't happen,
Yeah.
but it doesn't
And
strike me
it's
as
a-
preposterous that you would be enabling criminal organizations, paramilitary organizations, and other kinds of organizations to
I guess
tear this
what I'm
country
making,
apart.
I guess what I'm agnostic about everything you've just mentioned because honestly, I don't know the first thing about it. I literally know nothing about that country, that world, everything you're describing. I don't know anything about it. I'm not a jackass to pretend I do. I'm just saying that my gut is if someone who did know all about that stuff soberly looked at this and decided, nope, this is going to be, this is good and important. It's better for the United States, better for the people of Venezuela. There's the election, all of it. I would be very I would find it very difficult to say, no, no, no. There's a thing here in the UN that says you can't do it. I say, yeah, but the people who use the UN, they would never do the right thing. Like if at a poker game and
Yeah.
everybody's cheating, and I'm supposed to be the one that. So it's like to me, the first question to me is the practical question,
Yeah.
and if the practical question leans very very favorable, then I
Yeah,
feel like I'm inclined to support it.
yeah,
I,
no,
I
and I get that impulse. And again, I'm not a romantic about international law. I guess, but I would come back to the basic point I was making about why these international rules are in place is that these just are real like the internal politics of any country is extremely complicated. Just look at the United
right.
States, look anywhere. And one of the reasons we have a general rule of non-intervention, non-military intervention, is because every time you break open sort of the sovereign self-government of any country, you're potentially unleashing hell. And
Mhm.
if that is combined with great power politics, all of a sudden the assassination of, the Archduke of Serbia um, can lead to a conflagration in which the entire world is involved, right?
Yeah.
That's what the UN Charter, that's what international law, that's the
I
only thing they're
yeah,
designed
I
to prevent.
think
These aren't questions of justice, it's a question
uh,
of stability and preventing war.
just to add to that, I think is like I'm not optimistic because it's a country like we said that have not just a lot of resources, but huge. The best oil, even the type of oil, the type of mineral, it's very important. Let's go. Let's dive from another thing. What do you guys think of the justified? Is it justified not to inform the Congress before that, before the attack, because there are leaks?
You're the lawyer, Michelle.
I find that to be a bit pretextual. There are all sorts of like processes in place to inform Congress, at least so far, these so-called sort of gang of sixes, where you're telling the ranking and the ranking members of the intelligence and the armed services committees of what's going on when you have particularly sensitive international, sort of particularly sensitive national security, international just adventures underway. And I say that in part because, you know, the operation, look, I am a deep, deep admirer of the United States military and Defense Department. We can pull off some crazy shit. And the fact that we were able to essentially do this kind of hard, fast, lightning insertion attack into Venezuela and capture their head of state and his wife alive and move them out of the out back into Brooklyn, all within about 24 hours, just demonstrates an incredible degree of prowess that we have. But that prowess depends upon the coordination of literally thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people, to include diplomats in country, probably some foreign diplomats as well. And so, in that circumstance, not telling at least gang of eight members of Congress what was going on the grounds that there might be leaks strikes me as difficult to defend.
Well,
Yeah.
let me get in. So I wonder, Tucker Carlson like a month ago said that he heard that we were about to invade Venezuela. So one wonders whether or not there had actually been some consultation back then and it had leaked. That's just one possible explanation for that fact pattern. It could be Tucker Carlson made it up. But I would just say that a lot of these rules were written at a time when word couldn't travel across the world in an instant, and the obviously the whole operation depended on total surprise, and the risk of leak is real.
Of course, the risks of leaks are real, right? I wrote a book on D-Day, right? That was,
Yeah, yeah.
but again, when you have an operation of that, like impressive execution and scale, you already have thousands of people in the loop on that. And so I
That's
find it
true.
to be
That's
at
true.
least, I want to hear a really good explanation
Well,
for
did
why
were they
you would
were they
not
already in the
engage.
loop, or were they all like how long was it from the time the order was given to the time they went? Like I understand it was training and all that kinds of stuff.
On
But we already
D-Day or on
no, I'm talking about the
this
Venezuela
operation, I
because
don't know. That's going to be all classified. But
we already kind of knew something was
yeah,
brewing. Obviously, stuff had leaked all this stuff about a military action in
Well, we had
Venezuela.
carrier groups in, off the coast of Venezuela. So I mean, I don't know, but yeah, I think, but like again, something that tight, that coordinated, right? That's way more
Yeah.
significant than, for example, the Bin Laden raid. And the Bin Laden raid, you had dozens, if not maybe more than 100 people actively involved in the planning
That,
and execution of it.
that was a kindler, gentler time. You can't imagine anybody leaking to try to foil the Bin Laden raid. We look at just like by analogy, we had Supreme Court opinions being leaked to try to stop the overthrow of Roe versus Wade. It's just a very, very difficult time now.
I'm
I
not
prefer,
sure.
of course, they shared it.
We've always had leaks. So as I said, I wrote a
Nothing
book.
like that.
I wrote
No.
a book on D-Day, and in the weeks before the invasion of the D-Day, the words like what was it, Overlord, Omaha, Sword, Gold, Utah, all turned out to be clues in a crossword puzzle in the UK's Daily Mirror. Right, so like security is always going to be
Okay,
difficult.
let me
in
ask you
these-
this question. Like, just you have obviously you can't
Yeah.
know, but the Gang of Eight would include 3 or 4 Democrats. I'm assuming that you're
Yeah,
describing.
4
Right?
Democrats, 4
Yeah.
Republicans. It's the ranking members of the armed services and
What would you
intelligence committees.
what would you put the odds at that you could find 4 Democrats who would keep quiet about something as something they'd oppose so viscerally as what Trump was about to do?
Well, okay, I have 2 answers to that. One is, these are the 4 Democrats who are the again ranking members of the armed services and Senate, armed services and intelligence committees in the House and the Senate. So
Yeah.
this isn't, the far left flank of the Democratic Party to begin with. These are not anarchists. You don't get to be the ranking member of those committees by being the major bomb throwers. I can't name them off the top of my head, but these are sort of more of the very much establishment members of the Democratic Party who are going to be on those committees to begin with. And secondarily, right, there is that's also democracy, right? You began this conversation about, well, self-government, right? We have to have a society that is self-governed, and that's ultimately the test of legitimacy, and that I do agree with. But if we have a presidency that is able to act and effectively declare war all around the world without consulting Congress,
Yeah.
even the 8 members of Congress on the Gang of Eight, what kind of checks and balances do we actually have? What kind of actual consent of the governed do we actually have? Because I don't think my reaction to the invasion of Venezuela, which was more kind of like surprise and puzzlement than umbrage and outrage or celebration, I think my reaction is probably pretty common around the United States because unlike Iraq, and unlike many other of the sort of similar analogs that we could point to, including I would say Panama, this is not something where any political support for it had been built up in the public at large at all
Yeah. Well,
prior to its being executed.
So I looked it up. I'm assuming ChatGPT is right. I know the 3 Democrats are Jim Himes, ranking member of the House Select Committee, Hakeem Jeffries, Mark Warner, and Chuck
Yeah, Mark.
Schumer.
Yeah.
So listen, what you're describing, I don't actually disagree with you. What you're describing is kind of one of the really bad consequences of the Trump presidency, which meaning that in the past, no matter what the differences were, the president had a good working relationship with the responsible people in the opposite party, such that he could count on sharing such secrets. Reagan could talk to Tip O'Neill about it and have a pretty good assurance that Tip O'Neill wasn't going to spill it, right?
Isn't it illegal?
What?
Isn't it illegal to leak?
I don't think I think
It's
no.
complicated because like speech or debate, they could Congress members of Congress.
But the relationship, and this is Trump's fault, obviously, as much as anyone else's, is so sour between Trump and these other people, and the staff members, and it just and the technology, and it's just like it's a difficult time. The old rules and the old gentlemanly conduct that you could expect doesn't exist anymore, and we're going to have to work our way out of it culturally.
Right, but I think
it's not compatible with democracy, as you're saying.
right, but I think I would be a little more moved by those concerns if this were like the Bin Laden operation, right? If Trump was executing the Bin Laden operation, because you could say, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's going to be a lot of improper.
But who would have complained? Come on, let's be honest. Who would have
Right,
complained?
but I'm
Right?
just saying,
Yeah.
like, there's
No, I'm saying
or like,
that's your point. Everybody wants to get Bin Laden.
everyone, but
Yeah.
I'll even give it to from Trump's first term when they went after Baghdadi, right? Like, so if that was another situation where it required a lot of secrecy, a lot of precision to take out a more or less avowed enemy of the United States, and everyone was comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And if that was the circumstance under which Congress wasn't notified, I would probably be like, yeah, okay, these sort of, you got to keep things tight because there had been already a general sense of a consent of the governed that this guy is someone the United States needed to treat as a national security priority. That consensus, that sort of sense of public buy-in, political buy-in, and I don't mean in a partisan way. I mean literally informing the public about what the intentions of the government are, what the government's priorities are. Just doesn't exist for it just doesn't exist for Venezuela. And is that and the question is then why, right? Why execute this particular mission now? What was the imminence? What was the danger to
What do you think? What do you think the reason was that he did it? What do you think the actual reason is?
I don't know. And I don't know. I think that's one of the things that is that's just one of the things that is puzzling about it. I think that's why I and a lot of other people had the reaction of like, oh, we're in Venezuela now.
Well, let me focus in. What do you think? I think I know the answer to this actually. What do you think the reason that Rubio was so in favor of?
I think Marco Rubio has had a long sort of axe to grind against Maduro in Venezuela. And again, I'm not a defender of Maduro.
No, I know.
Just to be very clear, but I think he's always had a fairly hawkish interventionist view, which is ironically traditionally adverse to a lot of the sort of certainly of the MAGA movement and a lot of the Trump administration itself. And so I think certainly it doesn't surprise me that Rubio would be very much behind.
Because I read a little bit in the Times that Trump was skeptical about it and Rubio was pushing and pushing and pushing. And that would kind of sanitize to some extent the most cynical reads on how this came about. I'm sure Trump is happy to get the oil and if we were screwed out of those oil rights, I don't even know if
I don't
we were.
even know, right? I mean, but I look. I think Trump likes a W, and I think he was able to get that with the sort of the air attacks on Iran back in June, where they were able to come to the brink of something very serious, intervene in a way that sort of actually ended up de-escalating the situation. So your listeners don't think I'm just like being reflexively against President Trump in every context. That was executed really well, and I would have had far more reservations about that ex ante had you told me this is what you're going to plan to do, that than it turned out to realize. And so, I think he likes these sort of short, pretty wars. He certainly, I think, was encouraged by the success of that in Iran. And so I think was ultimately able to be sold on we're going to do a sort of in and out hot war with Venezuela to capture Maduro and take him to the United States. And again, maybe that'll turn out to be right, like it was in Iran. Again, I'm not trying to.
Is this the rub? Is this the rub? On the one hand, as you very eloquently described, if you just run roughshod over international law, you just make a mockery of all the institutions, and you basically give nations a license to do whatever they want on paper anyway. On the other hand, weakness is provocative, hand-wringing, nature abhors a vacuum. It has never been unreasonable to me to imagine that Putin, when he decided to go against Ukraine, when he did, a large part of that was he took the measure of Joe Biden and said, we're never going to have a clearer opportunity with an American president who's not going to do a goddamn thing than we have now. So in some way, you have to say, okay, Trump is doing this. On the one hand, he's damaging this international law respect that Michel has described. On the other hand, our adversaries in the world who really don't give a shit about international law are now in some way deterred because they say, well, we can't count on that American president being shy about taking action against us. And these are the two sides that I think any, honest person understands are real in the world. And
Yeah,
you want to find the sweet spot, right? You got to find the sweet spot.
so as you know, I'm a big fan of Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower loved institutions and rules because he understood that they could actually be that limits themselves can actually be the most empowering tool at your disposal. And so, for example, whether it was the Suez crisis or even the integration of the schools in Little Rock, Eisenhower always had this propensity to take extreme action, right? Like he sent the 82nd Airborne into the South. He, essentially split with our traditional allies, France and the United Kingdom, and joined with the Soviet Unions to stop the Suez crisis, right? He could take very abrupt, severe action in order to enforce rules and in order to enforce institutions. And he realized that the very, the very rationale of I'm just enforcing the rules enabled far greater uses of force with far greater legitimacy and far greater buy-in and less resistance than taking entirely unilateral action for essentially petty or personal reasons.
Yeah, the
And
United States had a lot of latitude in 1950. When was Eisenhower elected? The early 50s,
52 to 60. Yes
yeah,
and
yeah.
no. I mean, yes and no. I think the Soviet Union was far more of a competitor to the United States in the 1950s than it was at any point. Even the United Kingdom and France were
Well,
much greater.
they tested a bomb, right? But they weren't, economically they weren't.
But well, even economically, but like leaving the 1950s aside, to take the general point, I think you're probably right about Putin's measure of Biden, but he was wrong. And I think the success of the mobilization, particularly of Europe,
No,
and
the
the other,
weakness was dangerous. That's what I'm saying. He was wrong, but it was provocative.
well, it was wrong, but it was provocative. But he ended up getting his hand bitten pretty hard
Yes.
because Biden and the G7, which is not just Europe, but mostly Europe, was able to mobilize militarily and economically against Russia in ways that I don't think Putin expected.
And just
And that's sort of what I mean is I do think there is a what are people being deterred from doing? It's not clear to me. And if anything, I think it does create at least the a culture in which people feel like, okay, well, this is all going to be a mad dash, and so we have to arm ourselves to the teeth and take what we can as quickly as we can, because otherwise, someone else is going to do it, right? Like that's ultimately what the rules aim to prevent, but it's also what they enable, so that when someone violates the rules, you can use force, you can use, all of the tools at your disposal, whether or not they're economic, military, intelligence, diplomatic, political, cultural. Um, to enforce those rules, and that becomes I don't know, it just becomes much more empowering. And I think that if the Trump administration, I think, has one major strategic weakness, is it just underestimates the amount of power at their disposal when they actually use institutions and rules to achieve their ends, as opposed to always seeing those institutions and rules as obstacles to achieving their ends.
just to add also, that Venezuela army and it's not that strong. They don't have anything, So it wasn't like, a major operation that you can scare others with. I mean, it was brilliant, obviously, getting him right before, but it's more like a gang than an army, So it's not. Couple more question quickly before I know you have to go. Why is it in Manhattan? Why is the trial taking place in Manhattan
It's in Brooklyn.
and Brooklyn, New York City?
Most likely that's where they got the indictment unsealed. And also the way federal jurisdiction works is you are typically going to be tried in the place where you are found, or where the crime occurs. And so if they flew him into JFK, that's Brooklyn.
That's funny.
Just before you go, this whole Ukraine thing, I'm always puzzled by I do understand, and I'll even give some acknowledgement to the people who feel that if America had been more judicious about certain things, maybe they wouldn't have provoked Putin's action. I think that's possible. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but it's possible. Even Kissinger, various level-headed people were warning, hey, you might want to tone down your rhetoric about Ukraine and NATO. You're stepping on their nerves here. Why would you do that, right? But what I don't understand is the people who are objecting to the fact that we came to the aid of Ukraine, it seems clear to me, and you tell me where I'm wrong, you follow it much more closely than I do, that the most likely outcome here, whatever the plus or minus of it is going to be an independent Ukraine, somewhat some of it lopped off, but an independent Ukraine that will be much more secure than the previous Ukraine was. Russia will have a black eye. This will be Ukraine's George Washington moment. And this is tremendously better for the world than if we had just sat back and let Russia just sweep through Ukraine and gobble it up. How can anybody be upset with the fact that we defended Ukraine? If the Ukrainian people who died are not upset about it, then why would we be upset about it?
I don't know. I agree. I think, I'll steel man the argument as best I can. I think there are certain people whose sort of commitment to sort of, what would you call it, foreign policy realism would say, might makes right. I'm trying to make this
Yeah.
argument as clearly as I can, but sort of a might makes right. This is the sort of Russia's near abroad, and we need to give Russia a strong, stable Russia is better for the world than a weak rogue state Russia. I think that would be the best argument I could muster for it. But I agree with everything you said because I think ultimately, it's people get this is self-government in a nutshell, right? People get to decide who is their government and enabling people to resist foreign invasion so that they can govern themselves, I think is a fairly straightforward thing that the United States has done since the creation of the Monroe Doctrine, which
Yeah.
initially, I heard President Trump invoking this. I'll just say this: the Monroe Doctrine was actually a very provocative policy of the United States in the 19th century to basically say the United States will support, sort of the resistance to European powers in the Western Hemisphere, to put it very succinctly. But what that actually meant in the 19th century was essentially a policy of decolonialization, because most of the Western Hemisphere was under Portuguese, British, French, and Spanish colonial either direct control or very recently had been under the very direct control and therefore influence of those sort of European empires. And so the Monroe Doctrine essentially an early articulation of a certain kind of self-determination against European imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, in line with sort of the United States' traditional commitment to self-government, going back to the Declaration of Independence. It's easy to forget, as we're getting to our 250th anniversary, how radical that vision was in the late 18th century and how radical it actually remained
That's
up
right.
through World War II. And that's the success of it. And so anytime the United States does anything to undermine that basic appeal to letting people live their own lives and govern themselves, I think it's a dangerous precedent and a dangerous transgression of one of our greatest strengths as a country.
I'll let you. I just have this sanctimonious streak that always bristles at moral equivalence between our system and theirs, as it were. The fact that Haviv Retzagur, the Israeli writer, actually, and I had a conversation about this, and he kind of crystallized this point, even though I brought it up, that during the Cold War, um, uh, all the people were desperate, nations were desperate to be in NATO, right?
Yep.
And the Warsaw Pact nations were desperate to get out of that alliance. And
Right.
yet, through the lens of international law, no, that's their alliance and that's our alliance, and they should be treated exactly the same, as if we don't know that underneath it, that is an alliance of oppression, and America is an alliance of freedom. And the fact that you can't make that argument as you're analyzing real things in the world, I just can't keep that down.
But I
I'm
think you
not able
can.
to.
But we've had this conversation before in the past, like in talking about the war in Gaza, and something I always try and emphasize to my students when I'm teaching this, because I think it's a point that's often forgotten, is law does not equal right and
That's right.
morality, and just because something is legal does not mean that it is good, and just because something is legal doesn't mean that it has to be that way, right? It's just like there has to be a space for law which is interested in very specific very specific interests, particularly stability.
Right.
But politics is important too, right? We should be able to say in a very clear-throated way that if you live in a country where it's illegal to leave, right? Your immigration laws prevent you from leaving the country, that is a moral wrong. And so I think, but that's a political argument, not a legal argument. And I always resist, certainly on the left, on the human rights side, people who always try to conflate, I think, important moral and political claims with what is and is not legal. And I would say the same thing on the right as well, right? Just because international law doesn't make sense of the particular moral or political claims you're making doesn't mean that international law isn't also serving an important purpose that we should do our best to protect and defend, because it is a tool. It's a tool for, again, fundamentally just preventing wars. And even though, again, as you said, the United Nations has not prevented every war in the 20th century, we hadn't had another world war. And a major reason for that is we have created at least a format or a template in which great powers do not have to go to war to resolve all of their disputes, or at least war with one another and directly.
What?
And
maybe
I think
maybe that's
I
the
think the
reason.
United Nations
Maybe the experience of World War I and World War II
I
among
think
the
the United
living.
Nations didn't stop a lot of wars because of the veto. You know, there's countries that know that they can get away with stuff because they have a backup. The system of the veto is like, you can do whatever.
No,
Last two question quickly.
and Michelle, just also, we have to be honest and say this is post-nuclear era.
for sure,
And,
yeah, no,
yeah,
I'm not saying
that
it's.
might have an awful lot to do with yeah. But go ahead.
I'm
It's
not
unknown.
saying it's monocausal. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that have it like as you said, the lessons of World War I and World War II are why we haven't had one of the major reasons we haven't had a world war. And those lessons were hardwired into the code of the United Nations system. The United Nations exists precisely because of the Second World War and the desire first by Franklin Roosevelt, then Harry Truman, and then Dwight Eisenhower to essentially stabilize that institution to a point where we could actually have a place where we could negotiate and debate without having to do so over the point of a gun.
I don't like the fact that you both didn't appreciate my point that veto is the reason that there's no war. I should have standing ovation in this podcast. This is how smart this point is, All right, last two questions. Quickly, I still don't know why did we attack Venezuela right now? Like, why not next month? Why not next year? And the other one is like, are you okay with the things that was said about taking the oil companies, taking over all that stuff? By the way, do you know why Saddam Hussein occupied Kuwait? He said he stole oil from him. So it's the same shit,
Under the ground, right?
No, you don't have a green screen.
With a straw. I do have a green screen, but I stupidly wore a green sweater. That's why.
Oh, because you look like a ghost sometimes when you lean back. It's just your head comes out. All right, so why
I
did
was
you
going to try to change it, but I didn't want to change it while Michelle was talking. Go ahead.
Why did we attack Venezuela now? And you're okay with running the country, whatever that means, and taking the oil, have our companies do that shit.
So really quickly, why we didn't, I have no idea. As I said, I was as surprised as probably most people that mainly because this has not been a political priority around which the president or the government more generally has sought to mobilize. And so the fact that unlike Iraq, unlike Panama, unlike all of these other examples that we can point to, good, bad, and ugly, and stating that we're going to take the oil and run the place, it's hard to know exactly what Trump means in any particular situation when he's talking about these things, but I don't think that's helpful. I'll just say this maybe as a legal matter, just to make sure I'm only talking about stuff that I know. It's by saying you're going to run the place. Are you really committing the United States to occupying Venezuela? Is this really something the United States military wants to do? That's a commitment of hundreds of thousands of U.S. personnel to a country where we're going to have to run everything from the court system to its healthcare system to taking out the trash. And that's just not something the military likes doing. It's not what it's particularly good at. And inevitably, when you put a foreign army in charge of the government of a foreign country, you get a lot of hostility very quickly, whether or not in Iraq, it's obviously the most salient recent example, but there are certainly plenty of others. And so I don't know what he meant by that. I don't know how seriously we need to take that. I don't know what Secretary Rubio's intentions are, but I don't. So I don't know. Is the honest answer.
And I don't think he said we're taking the oil. I think he said we're going to fix the oil industry or something. He
No, he
said we're
said
going to
we
run
pay.
things, but I do not think he said we're taking the oil.
We'll pay ourselves. If we moved out of Venezuela, does that bring that means he brought peace to Venezuela? Is that another war that he stopped or no?
I don't know. I'm not
Technically,
on. I'm not on the Nobel committee.
right?
We got to go. Hatem,
Yep. Thank you
whatever
so
it
much.
is, can you imagine how awful a country must be if 1/3 of the people up and leave? Can you imagine what it is that they're dealing with over there? We need to think, I think we should hope that it works out.
I hope it
Obviously,
works out.
they are suffering enormous privation over there for 1/3 of a country to leave. And, before we get all academic, we really understand this is a serious thing going on over there,
Yeah.
which
Also,
I think why Rubio
yeah.
is so animated.
I want to thank you for having the Israeli forces join in the attack in Venezuela. You heard about that?
Israel's behind all of it. Israel's behind everything in the world now. We killed Charlie Kirk or Venezuela. What are we not behind?
Well,
We actually put Mamdani in just to just as a ruse, just as to
right at
divert
that
your
point.
attention.
Michelle, thank you so much. New book coming up soon?
Not yet. I'm trying to do a whole bunch of other stuff, but I promise I'll be back when I have another book.
All right, we'll have you. Until then, we'll see you at the olive tree very soon, hopefully.
Yeah, looking forward to it. All right,
See
Jen.
you later, Michelle.